Welcome to the worship service of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls. My name is Arthur Cole, today's worship associate. On this beautiful fall morning, come into this place of peace. Let its silence heal your spirit. Come into this place of memory and let its history warm your soul. Come into this place of prophecy and power, and let its vision change your heart. We have two announcements regarding next Sunday. Next Sunday, October 23rd, is going to be the Pet Blessing Sunday. So if you have a pet, please bring your pet along. And also, next Sunday, there won't be any religious education. It will be an intergenerational service. Also, please note that if you have joys, concerns, sorrows, and milestones that affected your life in the recent past and that you would like to share with the congregation, you can do so by filling out a little piece of paper that you find at the entrance to the sanctuary. And if you watch the service online, you can post them in the chat box to the right of the screen. Thank you. I invite you now to enter into the spirit of worship with words by Reverend Bill Schultz. May we be reminded here of our highest aspirations and inspired to bring our gifts of love and service to the altar of humanity. May we know once again that we are not isolated beings, but connected in mystery and miracle to the universe, to this community, and to each other. I will now ring the peace bowl 3 times for the official start of the worship service. Please join me in reading the Church's covenant, which is printed in the order of service. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We will now light the flaming chalice, symbol of our faith, to illumine this day with words by Reverend Christine Robinson. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Our call to worship this morning is the poem, "Where Does the Temple Begin? Where Does It End?" by Mary Oliver. Where does the temple begin? Where does it end? There are things you can't reach, but you can reach out to them, and all day long. The wind, the bird flying away, the idea of God. And it can keep you busy as anything else, and happier. The snake slides away, the fish jumps like a little lily out of the water and back in. The goldfinches sing from the unreachable top of the tree. I look, morning to night. I am never done with looking. Looking, I mean, not just standing around, but standing around as though with your arms open, and thinking maybe something will come, something shining, some shining coil of wind, or a few leaves from any old tree. They are all in this too. And now I'll tell you the truth. Everything in the world comes, at least, closer and cordially, like the nibbling, tinsel-eyed fish, the unlooping snake, like goldfinches, little dolls of gold fluttering around the corner of the sky, of God, the blue air. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 38, Morning Has Broken.
Today's Time for All Ages is Henry David Thoreau and the Still Small Voice. Henry sat in front of his little cabin on one of his 3 chairs, listening to the evening. If you were there, you might have thought there was nothing to listen to. Certainly no television or iPod. Those wouldn't be around for 100 years or more. There was no one to talk with, no airplanes overhead, no radio coming from next door. Mr. Emerson's house, the closest thing to a next-door neighbor, was over a mile away. Not that he had a radio to play, in any case. Even the natural world was still. No wind rippled the pond, and the birds had stopped singing as night approached. Still, Henry listened for the tiniest sounds. A small fish breaking the surface of the water and splashing down again, the crackle of leaves as a mouse passed by, the sound of wings as a crow passed overhead. To him, these miniature sounds were music. Of course, most of the townspeople thought Henry David Thoreau was crazy when he decided to build a tiny cabin from used materials out in Emerson's woodlot by Walden Pond. Why would a promising writer want to move away from society to sit with birds and bugs for company? In fact, Henry enjoyed the company of Emerson and the other thinkers who shared his transcendentalist philosophy. However, to him, the quiet of the pond and the animals and plants that lived in and around it provided excellent company. Sometimes, Henry thought, the conversation you learn the most from is the one in which the least is said. As he watched the last rays of light glisten on the pond, Henry thought about the biblical story about the prophet Elijah, who crawled off to a mountain cave to listen for what God wanted him to do. While Elijah stood outside his cave, a great wind whipped around the mountains, sending boulders crashing to the ground in the fury of its passing. But God wasn't in the wind. Then an earthquake rattled the mountain with a terrific rumbling, but God wasn't in the earthquake. Then came a fire sweeping across the rocks and brush outside the cave, red and roaring and grand, but God wasn't in the fire either. Finally, after all the roaring and crashing, everything became quiet. Elijah stood there shaking, wrapped in his cloak, just waiting. And out of the silence came the still, small voice of his God. I'm not at all sure, thought Henry, that I believe in that God of the Bible, the one who chatted with Elijah. But whatever God is, I'm pretty sure I know it better out here in the quiet than I would through any ranting sermon. Maybe God is speaking to me in the small voice of the jumping fish and the rustling leaves, the still pond and the stars beginning to peek through the trees. Maybe I hear God when my heart is still and I can listen with my very smallest inner ear. Maybe. And his thoughts drifted off with a small breeze that came and ruffled his hair and rippled across the quiet lake. The end.
We now dedicate time to our joys, concerns, sorrows, and milestones, a time to share with this religious community events that have affected your life in the recent past, and to speak out for those we want to hold in our thoughts. I have several here. Victoria says, the Idaho Falls Symphony last night was sensational. The violinist and her dress were fabulous. I have to agree with that. We are lucky to have a high-caliber symphony. And I would add to that that we had the composer, George Clinton, and his work, The Rose of Sonora, was performed last night here locally. And it was absolutely fantastic. Another one from Victoria. The Idaho Falls Opera Theater will be singing on Monday, 7 p.m. at the Presbyterian Church on Elm Street. It was great yesterday, so please take a note and come Monday at 7 o'clock.
Programs are right over there.
Okay, programs on the table back there, right. Okay, and I have one from Pam. Joy for the Life of Marilyn Watts, which was celebrated yesterday. Thank you. And another one from Pam. Welcome to all newcomers here. Thank you. Great. And one from Bambi, a concern, being able to afford a wheelchair and rent. And we light one last candle to lift up these joys. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have one?
And we have one from our viewers at home. This is from Anita Carpenter. She has a concern. May we all keep our friend B. Moyer in our hearts and minds. She remains at Lincoln Court and has some health challenges while there.
Thank you. Okay, we light one last candle to lift up these joys and concerns, as well as the ones that remain in the silence of our hearts.
I have two short readings this morning. The first is from the essay The Oversoul by Ralph Waldo Emerson, written in 1841. The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission, that overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is, and so to speak from his character and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty. We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within one man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. My second reading is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu's foreword in the book A God That Could Be Real by Nancy Ellen Abrams. For centuries, we have been stuck in a futile battle between believers and atheists, with each lampooning and denouncing each other's beliefs. It is my hope we can enjoy a new revival of true cultural dialogue, debate, and exploration. We must move beyond the politics and polarization that have come to characterize so much scientific, religious, and interfaith discourse in our time. The God that I worship is not one that sits in heaven, apprehensively worrying that humanity will discover his or her secrets. No, not at all. The God I believe in commands us to love God with all our mind and wants us to keep learning and discovering and exploring every inch or millimeter or nanometer of creation. Over time, we graduate from more simplistic understandings of God to richer and more complex ones. Far too often, God is a God of the gaps, where we fill our lack of knowledge with the belief that there must be a God. For many centuries, when our understanding of the universe extended just to the planets and the heavenly stars, we thought God resided just beyond. Then, as our knowledge of the universe expanded, we have pushed God farther and farther out in space, in time. God must be much more than just a placeholder for what we do not yet know. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. theology was considered a science because it included the full body of human knowledge, not only about God, but what was then known about the physical world we live in. In fact, theology was called the queen of sciences. And while some medieval scholars explored questions in areas that we would now call the natural sciences, the overarching standard of truth belonged to the accepted Orthodox Christian theology of the day. If your so-called science conflicted with accepted theological truth, then your findings were obviously wrong. If you had a different opinion about that, well, that could be very dangerous. You might easily find yourself tied to a burning stake like many of our theological ancestors. The Italian philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician Giordano Bruno is a good example. When I was in Rome a few years ago, I visited the monument commemorating his life in the Campo di Fiori square, which means field of flowers, the place where he was executed. He was held prisoner in the Castle San Angelo in Rome for 3 years and then burned at the stake on February 17, 1600. His crimes, in the eyes of the church, were supporting the Copernican model of the solar system, believing in a vast universe filled with suns with their own planets and moons, and advocating a form of Unitarian theology. Considered a martyr for freedom of thought, the larger-than-life statue of Bruno was erected in 1889 on the exact spot of his execution, facing the Vatican in permanent defiance. And the inscription on its base reads, "For Bruno, the century he predicted, here where the fire was burning." There's a photo of the monument on your order of service. We owe a lot to brave individuals like Giordano Bruno, who continued to advance the evolution of both science and theology through even the darkest times. And though religious intolerance and fundamentalism in a variety of forms continues to plague the human family, the world has generally grown more tolerant of diverse religious views, and today we see an incredible smorgasbord of beliefs and practices in most American communities. Our own Unitarian Universalist faith has also evolved to include a wonderful spectrum of theological diversity over the years. And even now, there are cutting-edge ideas in theology that I think we would do well to explore. The story of our Unitarian Universalist faith lies mostly in the Western Christian lineage, but you can see a similar evolution of ideas among all the great religious traditions. Change is inevitable because human beings learn and explore. Despite what we claim about our personal beliefs or even the most cherished doctrines of the church, new ideas come along from science and philosophy, and the old thinking must simply adapt. And when it comes to ideas about a topic like God or the afterlife, if we are honest, we have to admit that all theology is at its core speculation. Theologians can only speculate about the nature of the sacred and make reasoned arguments to support their propositions. Theology is not something that can be proven by logic or experimental evidence. We don't even think of theology as a science anymore because it cannot be tested by the scientific method. But that doesn't mean there are no theological truths that stand the test of time. Theology changes when old assumptions are challenged and when we discard ideas that no longer make sense. It is a healthy process, though it can be painful to abandon the old as we struggle to embrace the new. Sometimes old beliefs don't go quietly, and wars have even been fought over competing religious ideas. As religious liberals, we are more willing to explore new ideas and take theological risks. And historically, we certainly have. Though for our ministers, this has sometimes come at great personal and professional risk. We claim to respect the freedom of the pulpit, but we too have a long history of ministers who found themselves preaching too far outside of the mainstream, and it seldom ended well. Even someone as exalted as Emerson ruffled quite a few feathers among the Unitarian establishment when he spoke of revitalizing religion by tapping into the lived experience of nature and the divine. It is really no surprise that after seminary, he left the ministry after less than 3 years. On the Universalist side of our family, the good news of universal salvation was central to the preaching you would hear on just about any given Sunday, usually backed up by dozens of biblical citations to prove its theological correctness. But sometimes even the idea that everyone was worthy of God's love and salvation was too much to tolerate. According to one legendary story, once when Reverend John Murray was preaching in Boston in the late 1700s, one of his opponents threw a large rock through a church window and narrowly missing his head. Without hesitation, Murray picked up the rock and said, "This argument is solid and weighty, but it is neither rational nor convincing." Then laying the rock aside, he announced, "Not all the stones in Boston, except they stop my breath, shall shut my mouth." These days, it is less common to hear much real theology preached on Sunday mornings, even in liberal churches, and I think that is unfortunate. It is easier and honestly safer for many of us to simply revisit familiar themes that speak to the human condition within a comfortable context and language, without pushing the theological envelope even a little. We may not fear being beaten in the head by a rock or burned at the stake anymore, but in some religious circles, especially in more conservative churches, uttering anything too controversial can still be risky. Also, I think many ministers shy away from the best theology they study in seminary and beyond because it is complex and challenging. It is admittedly hard to preach on very complex topics without feeling you're only scratching the surface. Good theological conversations can last many hours. And if you get an opportunity to really explore such topics within a congregation, you will find that we have all kinds of interesting ideas to consider. Unfortunately, most people are limited to what they hear on a Sunday morning, and there are many other subjects that rightfully compete with theology for attention in our worship services. Deep theological musings week after week would also become overbearing for most people. Sometimes when we come to church, we just need to be comforted and lay our burdens down. But if our faith hopes to remain relevant and vital going forward, I do think we need to make time for more theological exploration in our pulpits. Our faith, after all, is a journey of discovery, and Sunday morning is the best chance most people have. In planning my Sunday sermons, I try to find a balance between topics in the category of what I would call practical theology that speak to the challenges of our ordinary lives, such as my sermon on forgiveness a couple of weeks ago, and sermons that explore our Unitarian Universalist history and theology and our call to do the work of social justice. I also reflect on religious naturalist ideas that explore our connection to the earth and to the cosmos and the interdependent web of all existence, not only because it lies at the heart of my own theology, but because I believe it is the most important theological influence on contemporary Unitarian Universalist theology. So today, I want to take a deeper look at one of the many strands of thinking that would fall under the general philosophical category of religious naturalism. What I want to explore in the rest of my sermon this morning is one possible answer to the question, where might God exist in a universe that is mostly invisible, constantly evolving, and still very mysterious to the one form of intelligent life on earth that has emerged with the capacity to even ask such a question. So let's begin by considering where God is not. The title of my sermon today is intended as an allusion to the famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, that Jonathan Edwards preached in Enfield, Connecticut in 1741. That sermon is considered to be one of the exemplary works of religious thinking during the so-called Great Awakening period in America. And it is filled with images of the horrors of hellfire and damnation that await those who are not saved. It was literally a sermon designed to scare the hell out of everyone so they would repent and turn to Christ for salvation. As an example of his imagery, Edwards famously compares humanity dangling over the pit of hell to a spider dangling by a web over a fire. The only thing keeping our depraved, sinful selves out of the well-deserved eternal fires of hell is the grace of God, and God is very angry with us. I'm guessing that most of you these days would find such a sermon troubling, to say the least. Our Unitarian Universalist ancestors had a lot of trouble with these ideas too, so their theology evolved over the next several decades toward a more benign view of the Almighty and a more sympathetic understanding of humanity. They acknowledged that we human beings are capable of great sin, but they also saw that we are inherently capable of great good and worthy of salvation. But even so, they still held on to the idea that God was something apart from the universe. He was out there somewhere, pushed farther and farther away as our knowledge of the universe expanded. God increasingly became the God of the gaps, our second reading described. And then after a few more decades of scientific discoveries, humanism swept through our faith and very nearly pushed the idea of God completely out the door. It seemed like we had to make a choice between having a conventional concept of God or having no God at all. And the debate has remained contentious to this day among Unitarian Universalists. But what if there was at least a third option? As we begin to dig deeper, let me unpack what I mean by the unusual title of today's sermon, Constituents in the Heart of an Emergent God. And it is probably best to start at the end of the phrase and work backwards. What do I mean by an emergent God? In general, emergence describes something that comes out of something else. In this case, I'm specifically talking about an idea from the field of systems theory that refers to a quality or trait that can only be realized by a system at a certain level of organization. It is the opposite of reductionism, which suggests that everything true about the world can be deduced by reducing layers of complexity to smaller and smaller components, ultimately looking at the interaction of the tiniest particles. Emergence responds to the unpredictability of characteristics that reductionism cannot explain. For example, think about all the layers of complex systems that make up a living creature. At the lowest level, there are elementary particles, then atoms, then molecules, then more complex molecules like DNA, then cells, then organs then systems of organs like the circulatory system, then finally the organism. At each level of complexity, there are attributes or traits that have no meaning at lower levels and could never be anticipated by looking up the chain. We say, for example, that cells and organisms have the quality of being alive. But you could never predict the quality of being alive by only looking at the billions of atoms at the lower levels, or even at the multitude of chemical reactions between molecules upon which life depends. So we can say being alive is an emergent quality of a cell or an organism. Another example is the quality of intelligent behavior, which is an emergent quality of organisms with complex brains. These are demonstrably real qualities. that are easy to observe and describe, but they only exist within a certain context. Now let's take this up to a level of society. We can talk about something like market forces or culture or the media as if they are real things. But these concepts are emergent and only exist when there is an underlying society of human beings that enables their existence. Here again, clearly these concepts are real in the context of society, since we can all understand them and give examples, but they make no sense at the level of an individual and are absurd to speak about at the cellular or atomic level. So back to this idea of an emergent God, what might that mean? Nancy Ellen Abrams, who is a philosopher of science and a religious naturalist, explores this idea very nicely in her 2016 book, A God That Could Be Real, Spirituality, Science, and the Future of Our Planet. She begins from this simple proposition. If we look for God in what is real, the argument about God's existence is over, and we begin to discover its true nature and relationship to us. She then develops this idea of an emergent God using the same kind of arguments about emerging phenomena that I just described. She writes, God is endlessly emerging from the staggering complexity of all humanity's aspirations across time. Each of us is directly connected to the emerging God. In other words, an emerging God is a phenomenon that can exist because of human consciousness, and only because of human consciousness. It may be startling to say that out loud, but an emergent God simply could not exist without us. But that doesn't make God any less real. Let that sink in a minute. An endlessly emerging God that arises from the combined aspirations of humanity, with each of us connected to this sacred creative force. Taking it a step further, this idea that God emerges from the combined human aspirations is why I say we are constituents in the heart of an emerging God. We are constituents because it is through the mutuality of humankind that an emergent God has existence. We and everyone who ever lived or will ever live are all part of God. It is an idea that sounds very familiar to Emerson's description of that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. It is an ancient idea, as old as the mystic teachings of holy men and women throughout the ages. And yet, by embracing the concept of emergence from the scientific world, it presents us with an image of God that is both relevant to contemporary theology and consistent with the truths about the universe observed by the latest physics and cosmology. This is important because recent scientific discoveries may very well be able to describe the origins of our strange and wonderful universe with its mysterious dark energy and matter without appealing to a creator. And this is one of the last refuges for the God of the gaps. For those who find the concept of God to be useful and relevant, it may be soon hard to locate God anywhere else with any intellectual integrity. And if you think this is just humanism hiding behind some clever God language, remember that emergent phenomena are real within the right context. Emergent God theology proposes that such a God is as real and worthy of worship as any other God we might imagine. The important element is that consciousness must first exist. And it is our consciousness that allows us to overlay meaning on the events we experience. As Abrams suggests, you could say God did not create the universe. God created the meaning of the universe. It is because of our combined human journey through time that we have values and apply names and meanings to the world of our senses. You might even say God is the conceptual framework that holds the universe together. As I warned you earlier, I can only give you a glimpse of the possibilities of emergent God theology in a Sunday sermon. If this kind of theology appeals to you, also consider this is just one among many new ideas about God that have been proposed over the last century, as theology tries to reconcile with our growing scientific understanding of the universe. There are fascinating theological ideas ranging from very complex philosophical frameworks like process theology to thinking of God as the creative force at work in the universe, and even the so-called non-realist ideas that propose that God ultimately has no objective reality at all, but is merely a useful mental construct. Each idea is worthy of exploration, but I find the idea of an emergent God, humanity's God that arises from our shared aspirations, a God that brings meaning to the world, is a God I could relate to and celebrate in worship. An emergent God invites us to retain the language and rituals of our human story while exploring bold new possibilities that are exciting and sometimes a bit challenging. That said, I should note that one thing about this concept I'm wrestling with is whether we should extend these ideas beyond human consciousness to the differing levels of consciousness present in animals and potentially even in plants. And for that matter, what about other intelligent life forms that likely exist in this vast universe or even a multiverse? Does this imply there is a pantheon of different emergent gods spread across time and space? Mind-blowing, isn't it? I hope this gives you some good theological thoughts to chew on. What we reflect on in Sunday morning worship can present some powerful ideas and implications. I'm reminded of a great quote about Sunday worship from the author Annie Dillard, who said, "Does anyone have the foggiest idea of what sort of power we blithely invoke? It is madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews." So I say to you this morning, let us continue to be bold on our theological journey. It's how we roll as Unitarian Universalists, and is why we have communities like this one to support us in our spiritual exploration, wherever it may lead us. Each of us must examine new ideas to see what might be a good spiritual fit, and this often changes over time. I hope sermons like this one will help stimulate your imaginations and encourage you on your way. I now invite you to rise again in body or spirit and join us in singing our closing hymn, number 23, Bring Many Names.
So
Our closing words are from the book, A God That Could Be Real by Nancy Ellen Abrams. The last time anyone in the West had a coherent big picture that pulled together God, the universe, and daily life was the Middle Ages. And it was possible then only because so little was known and so much was imagined. The Middle Ages effectively ended when Galileo was silenced by the Catholic Church under the threat of torture for teaching what was in fact the truth. Science and religion parted ways. God lost his physical place in the scientific universe, but remained an ineradicable part of our psyches, so that the battleground between science and religion was now inside us. But our images of God have barely changed at all. Our thinking about God today is like a potted plant that is root-bound and can barely grow. The pot is made of old metaphors, images, and stories. Not only are science and spirituality not necessarily antagonistic, but science may be the only way to break out of the pot and put our spiritual roots into the earth and the cosmos, where they can grow freely, where they can be coherent with reality.
Please join me now in reading the words for the extinguishing of our chalice flame. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.